Just letting in a couple more folks here and then we'll get started. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to this month's sustainability series. This is a monthly, was in person at the Rochester Public Library. Now we've gone virtual, where we host kind of an hour-long conversation on a variety of sustainability topics ranging from environmental, financial, or social equity topics. And today we are joined by Jess Roberts from the University of Minnesota Design Center to talk about kind of a case study and a process that we developed and applied to the Discovery Walk project here in Rochester. Talk both about our experience, its relevance to future projects that we're working on, as well as opportunities and maybe a discussion where it might be applicable for other things in the future. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to Jess Roberts and let him take it from here. One kind of clerical thing is if we have questions, if you could type them in the chat, that just might help limit the number of voices that we have on the call. One other thing is this series is being recorded as well as all the others since April, and I'll share the link to this recording and the presentation slides after we're done here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jess. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Thanks, Jess, for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So Kevin, I'll look to you to feed me questions as they come in. I find that I have a Mac and I'm just using this in the browser. So if I try to navigate to the chat, I don't know how to get back. So I'm going to let you feed me questions as they come in. And also, so Kevin was also a key part of this process. So as you see things relevant, particularly to this group, Kevin, be sure to chime in and fill some of those gaps. I think we'll give sort of an overview of what we've done, how we applied it, who we worked with. And then as Kevin said, I think a key component to that then is to discuss how or what about this many of you see applicable to the work that you've done, that you're proposing to do, because I think one of the things we learned is that each of these co-design processes are going to look a little bit different based on the communities you're working with and the particular challenge you're looking to tackle. So, Kevin, you want to go to the next? And Kevin's driving because, again, I have a Mac. So, so this all started a little while ago, this effort, this process and the project we'll be discussing with a small group of a steering team of folks representing government, nonprofit, the health systems, and DMC really was sort of the key co-convener to this, because in the DMC materials was this idea of America's City for Health. And this group was born out of, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? And in particular, what does that look like from the communities that are actually living here, those being impacted by the daily, project, policy, and programming decisions being made. So as you see here, we engage folks like the Diversity Council, the city, county, Mayo, county public health department. This has grown a bit since this point. We have some folks that sort of jump in and out, but a pretty broad representation of folks working in different corners of the community. And a key to this isn't just that they brought a unique perspective, but they brought relationships that we were able to leverage in this work, which we'll talk a little bit about later, being, really critical to doing this work well. But it was also, I think one of the things we heard early in the work was, there's a lot of work happening. There's a lot of, community engagement happening. We're asking a lot of questions about health and equity and sustainability already. So how can we actually build on and leverage the information that's already collected to honor that information that the community has already shared? And these organizations really had a good body of that information already. So why community co-design? You can go, yeah. So there's in the traditional sort of engagement practices, we really found that there's some key barriers, both at the community and individual participation level, that make true sort of collaboration with community pretty difficult. And I think probably most important to that is that there's always a power differential in those making decisions and those sharing their sort of lived experiences with these challenges. Very often, and almost exclusively, those living particular challenges rarely have the power, the decision-making power to change anything about that circumstance. And it needs to go beyond just asking community, well, what they're dealing with, and then still sort of maintain the power with one small subset of the community making the decisions over and over again. So that's probably the biggest barrier to doing co-design or collaboration well. Other barriers are, we overvalue things like, degrees and learned experience over that lived experience, and not recognize that we can get really close to a particular issue. You can spend your life, in fact, researching a particular issue. But if you're not living that issue on a day-to-day basis, you still have a fundamentally different perspective about both the scale and impact, but also the urgency to address the particular issue. And I think we see this with physicians, for example, oncologists that are the most humane, empathetic, physicians. They can be the most humane and empathetic physicians, but if they get a diagnosis, they realize, I truly didn't understand a cancer diagnosis until I had my own. So it's really drawing on that lived experience and recognizing there's just a distrust, right? Distrust of those power differentials we talked about in the government and institutional bodies. And many of you are probably aware of participation barriers. So meeting location, times, cost, transportation, lost wages, childcare, all of those things are barriers, and they only are amplified for individuals who may be most impacted by a particular challenge. I'll pause when when it's time to change our slides here. So we developed a couple of core guiding principles for our work that would guide how we approach this, how we built sort of the co-design process. And I mentioned a little bit before about, there's a humility and inclusivity that needs to guide all of this, and recognize that, again, that while the expertise is valuable in particular areas, it still is only a part of the picture. You can really contextualize challenges when you draw from people's day-to-day lived experiences in meaningful ways. And so we really look to include in meaningful ways those community members who typically haven't had a voice in this, and who, maybe, as we mentioned before, the individual barriers wouldn't be able to show up to a regular community convening. The other one that's sort of loud and clear, particularly here in Minnesota, is, we're sort of the land of 10,000 nonprofits. So there's a lot of energy and resource flowing to address particular issues. But too often it's a lot of assessment and repetitive assessment. Communities, you find that communities are really starting to get burned out, having the same conversations over and over, and nothing change. And so what we really look to do is create an ecosystem that allowed for direct impact on particular projects or policy. If the community member, the co-designer, didn't have that ability, then that probably wouldn't be a good fit, a good project. The other components that I'll mention is what we call radical collaboration. So this is recognizing that while you can't be universally inclusive in representing every possible perspective and experience in the community, it's being really thoughtful and intentional about bringing those diversity of perspectives, experiences, cultures, age, gender, geographies, etc. Not because it's just because it's the right thing to do, but because diversity really is the birthplace of creativity. Creativity isn't just a bunch of people getting together and coming up with a sort of light bulb moment. Um, Creativity, by definition, is simply combining existing ideas and experiences in new ways. And so, in that way, bringing those diverse perspectives together is the only way to truly infuse creativity into your work. And then all the sort of recognition, which I think sort of relates to some of the humility, is recognizing this is a work in progress. It always will be. There isn't going to be a stock or standard set way to do this, and we're never going to be perfectly right, but we're going to just start and learn our way forward, and incorporate those learnings not as something that says, well, that will sort of argue whether or not it worked. It's what can we do different or better next time. And so I think that's a key piece to this. Next, yeah, there we go. So the way we're really looking to turn these principles into action was sort of three core pieces, and you'll see this in the co-design process. One, again, back to that idea that you focus on a community's daily lived experience of health or a lack of health. So again, that lived experience as being central and being able to contextualize and in many ways humanize some of these big abstract problems, be it homelessness, diabetes, loneliness, whatever the health issue might be. The second one being you need to create an opportunity for that co-design and co-production at all phases, not just on the front end when we'll ask community for some input, or on the back end when we say, here's two options for a particular project, now choose which one you like, but rather they have active roles throughout that conception of the project, the development and design of the project, as well as the execution and assessment of that project. And then finally, maintaining an orientation around the things that contribute to health rather than things that take away. So instead of just identifying gaps, a more ripe approach is oftentimes to identify what are the resources that are already in place. And in particular, what are the resources or assets we might not otherwise think about? Because for a lot of communities, the healthcare system may not be their primary asset when talking about their health, right? It may be their faith community. It may be a neighbor down the street. So we want to identify what those assets already are. Apologize for the delay. I suspect there's some, digital delay. So I think the other thing that's important, and I think goes along with our sort of humility principle, is that we didn't come at this with sort of a brand new to the world idea. We also have, the humility to recognize those don't exist. So we looked at what has worked well elsewhere. We drew from things like health impact assessments, from some of the new LEED criteria for community engagement. We looked at, community-based participatory research, human-centered design, and really looked to draw from what worked well from these different practices and approaches and apply them into something that ideally is sort of brings the best of many worlds rather than some particular really rigorous step-by-step approach.
I am trying to keep up, Jess. It
Yeah.
seems like it is just delayed a couple seconds.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the really important parts of this, probably one of the most foundational documents we created, was what is that framework for doing for that co-creation, for that co-design, beyond, bringing people together. As I mentioned a little bit before, I think probably most importantly is identifying what types of projects, programs, or policies are actually a good fit for this approach. And maybe more importantly, which ones are not. Because too often we'll try to bring in community far too late in the process. And we'll try to engage them around issues that just really don't matter for them. So identifying projects where the community can actually impact the outcome, where they can see the outcomes that they themselves help drive, is critical. If you can't have that, it's likely not a great opportunity, because community, like I mentioned, is burned out with the talking about issues and not seeing results. Additionally, there needs to be the willingness from the decision makers. There needs to be resources to actually, we'll talk about a little bit more about it, compensate these co-designers in a meaningful way beyond something like coffee cards, right? Like literally compensating them for their expertise. Then it's finding, who are those key potential co-designers, and this is where those connections with different organizations and efforts around the community really pay off, because the most important part of this process by far is the relationship and trust that you can leverage in the co-design process. Or if you didn't leverage that trust, you're going to be engaging community who's already skeptical of you, and here's another flavor of the month. And you're going to spend your entire time trying to convince and build that trust, and not actually get to work. What we found was being able to leverage our, the Diversity Council, Mayo Clinic, folks that were engaged in the community health needs assessment. They already had some trust and wanted and had some energy around these particular topics. In this case, it was Discovery Walk. And so from day one, they were ready to work. They were comfortable with each other. They were comfortable with the facilitators. And that, I can't underscore how important that is in this process. Then also recognizing we're not starting from scratch, because too often, like I said, we continue to sort of go out and ask the same questions. So we leverage the community health needs assessment that was already taken place. It takes place every 3 years in the community. So what did the community already tell us, right? It was issues of loneliness and mental health and substance abuse. So let's start there. Let's start with what's already known, what the community has already determined as sort of core concerns or priorities, and use that as the lens for this project. And then we'll talk a little more about the co-design, specifically the co-design process and what that looked like. But that was the actual, coming together, doing the co-research, co-design, and then obviously the delivery, which is where I would say the Discovery Walk project is sort of in. And then also engaging those same people in describing the work, in communicating the project, the program, or the policy, helping to determine not just that we should evaluate, but what should we be evaluating. Sometimes it's not the things that we traditionally measure that community cares most about. So again, end to end, how does community, those co-designers, actually have fingerprints on this full framework? So for the Discovery Walk process, there were sort of three key buckets. One was the project team, so that was the steering, mostly the facilitators, the project firm that was doing the work on Discovery Walk. So these were the core folks that would be in each and every one of those co-design sessions. The community partners are those that we drew on to, again, identify who would make a good co-designer, because it's not just anyone and everyone. There's a relationship component, but there's also folks that can sort of work together well, right? They are okay with some ambiguity. They are comfortable having conversations in their community. So it's, again, a balance of who ideally you would want to involve in that process and who's going to be actually a good fit, so that we don't get derailed, because one person that isn't a good fit can really derail the process. So we, again, relied on those community partners to identify who those best fits would be. And then there's obviously the community co-designers, and so those are the community of various communities that we drew into the process that brought those diversity of experiences, but weren't intended to be a universal representative of their particular community that they self-identify with. In fact, they were simply an avenue or a way to share the perspectives of others in their communities, share the experiences of others in their communities. Sure. Is it
I think
moving,
I
Kevin?
advanced. Yeah, it's showing up on my end, but
Okay.
it's still coming down from space, maybe.
Yeah, it's lost in the satellite somewhere. I don't know if others. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
So this is the intention of this, and this is from it's called the Spectrum of Public Participation. And this is a sort of framework that the city of Rochester uses, and is many municipalities actually use to look at how do we move up this gradient of community engagement. And what I was mentioning before about going out and talking to community, that's really more of the inform, maybe consult level. What we really looked to do was how do we move this into that collaborate and empower space? We probably live mostly in the collaborate space for this, but it was again about a timeline that allowed for longitudinal engagement with a particular set of community members instead of a 1 hour workshop. We compensated them meaningfully for this. They were parts of communities. They self associated with communities that typically didn't have a very loud voice in many of these areas, and we were really intentional about getting out of the way, mostly just creating this space and structure for them, and truly just following the lead of community in the ways that we could. And I think like I said, we probably managed to work mostly in the collaborate, but people on the back end of their experience really shared that they did feel empowered in many respects, particularly as it compared to other community engagement activities they've been part of in the past. So this is maybe the most important aspect of this is how do you do this, and paying attention to the details of how you do this, because everyone talks about, sure, we want to collaborate, community engagement, equity, there's all these sort of words out there, but how we actually do that, I think is really critical. And this, I think, is really the key takeaway, is this structure. More than anything, I mentioned it's this longitudinal engagement instead of a one-off conversation with community, so they could go much deeper, as well as they were the design. They weren't in. It wasn't intended so that the individuals were somehow universally representative and being able to share universally on behalf of their community. Instead, they were able to engage their community. So this is really drawn from anyone that's been part of a design process, that sort of studio model that designers are educated and practice in really is this, right? It's that iterative process of coming together with peers and stakeholders, going out, developing ideas, bringing it back, getting feedback, and then taking it back out and getting feedback again. This is literally where back to the drawing board came from. It's this very process where you took it back to the drawing board to bring something else back for people to respond to, instead of creating a plan, executing that plan, and then asking for feedback. This is feedback, meaningful feedback throughout the process. So you'll see a couple key components to this is the studios. So those are the square boxes. And these are those in person, but for this project was mostly in person and then some virtual. gathering of the co-designers, where we would ground one another on, what is the project, what are the expectations, what are we looking to do over the next couple weeks. We would give each of them some artifact to start from in terms of, here's sort of a set of questions we're curious about. Go out and ask them in the ways that you feel fit the conversations you would have with your community or neighbors or friends. If you need to translate them, you can translate them. You don't need to ask each of these. You can ask, a few of these. You can ask your own questions. But here's generally where we have some curiosity and a start point for you to go out. And that's where the sprints where they would go out into their communities and have these conversations. And I think the real important part of that is that instead of us going out in the community asking, we could ask the same questions. We are not leveraging the trust that they have with they're having conversations with coworkers, neighbors, friends, family. And so they are able to get a depth. They're able to get insights that no matter how much resource or time we put into this work, would never be able to get at. And additionally, they're usually having conversations with folks who would not show up to, community gatherings, to a city council meeting, whether that's because of barriers to getting there or you just, the sort of discomfort of being able to speak up in a setting like that. So they're able to access voices that almost never are part of this process. And then they would come back with that information and we would collectively synthesize that. And then oftentimes within about 24 hours, the facilitators would take that information and say, well, here's what we heard. Here's sort of the top 10 things we heard. Take 2 of these that you think is most important and ask these questions or come with ideas around these things. And so people would come with really diverse feedback. Some just notes on a piece of paper that they took and would share. Some had PowerPoints. Some had boards, like foam core boards, where they had done collages and things like that. So it really opened the opportunity for them in the ways that they're comfortable and want to express themselves and share their insights and their community's insights, to do it in the way that they feel most comfortable, which again also opens you up to new insights that we wouldn't have seen any other way. And so the facilitator really has to be active in helping, again, follow the lead of community, synthesize that information. I touched base with each and every one of those co-designers during each one of those sprint sessions, which was generally, I think, a 2-week period, and would coach and help adapt what those next steps would look like, because everyone comes at it with a little different lens, a little different skill set. So the co-design really does need that support throughout. It isn't just go have this conversation. It's, how might you do that is going to really vary across the individuals you bring together, hopefully, because you should be bringing together some of that diversity. And so really oh, go ahead, Kevin.
No, sorry to interrupt. There's a question in the chat when you're ready.
Yeah, so I think this is just, again, if you can sort of think about this in these iterations where a studio and a sprint is sort of one iteration. So we did 4 iterations, or 3, I guess, with a final report out. And it sort of depends on the project, what you're trying to do, depending on the length of this, but it really wasn't a huge amount of time. You can see it's about 18 hours was the commitment for community co-designers. Some probably went above that, some were maybe below that, but that's how we compensated them. We figured on the hours that they were putting in, and then we walked through that process with them. And now they are also involved in the actual design development process, because the design team, so the other important thing to note is in these design sessions is that the design team are part of those as well, to listen, to hear, to ask questions. And we heard from them the same thing, right? It was, I would have never thought to ask that question. I would have never thought of that idea otherwise, right? So it was in real time demonstrating that unique value add, that information we were getting that you can't get any other way. I'll take that question, Kevin.
Sounds good. Yeah, it was, what was the goal initial question to frame the conversation?
Sure.
So,
So that's important, and that's a good question because um, we could ask people, well, what's your ideal park, right? Or what do you want to see in a park? And that's pretty abstract, and we'd get the same sort of responses we almost always do, right? Like more green space, maybe different colored benches or something. Instead, we ask people, where do they go to feel well? Right? Like, what activities do they partake in? The intention of this process, more than anything, was to develop design principles, not necessarily specific design interventions. That's where the expertise of the design team comes in play. But they need a set of principles to design around beyond we want benches or more trees or whatever it might be. It was things, and we'll share in a little bit, things like feeling welcome. That's where we go to spend our time. And many times that was not a park, and that's okay. We want to know where that asset orientation, what are people doing? Where are they going to find some of this reprieve and healing and feeling well? And what about that space communicates that? Because that's the stuff we can actually design around instead of, some version of, the park that was already designed. Hopefully that got at the question. We can go to the next slide, Kevin. You may have already.
I think I did.
Okay.
Wait.
Okay, so you can see here we had these 7 community co-designers, which represented a pretty broad cross-section of cultural backgrounds, of ages, of physical and mental abilities, etc. So again, this is not certainly not did we expect or intend this to be universally, inclusive. That's just not going to be possible. But we realized also it was a place to start, and that they would all bring more than anything. I think this process helps you raise questions you didn't have before, which then is also another entry point to engage other communities to see, is this also a question or a concern that other communities have. So generally with this process, you don't want more than 7 to 10 participants, because otherwise you're really going to cut into their ability to share and engage one another, and in some instances debate one another. If you have too many people, it's just too rapid fire, and you want folks to, number one, feel like their input matters and is being incorporated, and time to actually synthesize what we think we're hearing. So this is a good, I think, rule of thumb to try and keep the size of those groups smaller. The key to this is that you can have a lot of community conversations. This is your opportunity to go deep. A lot of the community conversations you'll get really broad, but this is about that depth and context. So Kevin, we can probably go through this a little.
Yeah. Yep. I think I forwarded it, but there's also a question in the chat too. Did you get a lot of interest applicants for the co-designer role?
We didn't do applications for this one because, well, partly because we were leveraging the relationships that we had with different communities. So the application was sort of facilitated by our community partners. I think in other projects that are looking to replicate this, they are doing some form of applications. But the key here again is when we think about equity, applications are a barrier. So I think that's the other piece, is that it's difficult to rely on applications because again, you're going to filter who it is that's going to reach out to participate. So the key outcomes here were really across 3 different areas for Discovery Walk itself, and that was, obviously the spatial, what we all think about with parks, but probably more importantly, programmatic, so how the park functions, and then policy, the bigger picture things, the structures that are in place to support many of the things that were brought up in these co-design sessions. And you can maybe guess ahead, Kevin, with some of these so we can move through
Yeah,
them.
I'm trying to guess ahead and still blowing it, but
Yeah. So some of the spatial elements were, particularly for some of our newer immigrant populations, you know, winter was really difficult. Number one, it's really isolating. It's dark. The climate made it difficult to find places, communal places to go, which would include warmth, light, access to natural spaces, etc. Another key thing was, spaces for reflection and healing, recognizing that um, with Mayo Clinic right at the doorstep, while we've come a long way in healthcare, there's still a lot of caregiver and patients dealing with a lot of anxiety and pain, and clinicians, quite frankly, with burnout and loss. How do you create spaces that help uh, give some healing that people can sort of quote unquote get away to when they're dealing with heavy news? Programmatic was again probably the richest conversation. Again, being welcoming was probably the one of the biggest areas that folks wanted to focus on, and that meant a lot of things. That meant the planting, the flags, the colors, the languages that apply to more than just a German or Norwegian background, right? It's the how does this draw us in so that we see things that are familiar? Because familiarity was a key component to whether or not something was welcoming or warm. Um, Spaces and opportunities to promote connection and friendship because again, um, isolation was one of the key issues that were raised prior to COVID. So this is going to be even more of a focus and challenge. And then also just that it's dynamic. It isn't just a static space or programming, but rather opportunity to change over time. It isn't just the same thing over and over, because particularly for our younger folks, they talked about, we go to places because it's quote unquote Instagrammable. And I don't think that's a word, but that idea that we can connect it to the way we actually see and engage the world, be that if that's through social media, that people would talk about going to prom and going to a particular place because it was, a place you would Instagram. So how do you make something similar to draw people in, that younger people who may not engage in traditional park spaces?
the one thing I might add is that it also led to some really interesting discussions around art and
Right.
art that relates to different cultures in Rochester too. I think I advanced, Jess. Oh.
Okay. I think what's coming is the policy questions and or insights, and those are in particular some of the things like cost associated to rent park space was a big challenge for a lot of communities. So it simply made it unavailable. So are there lower rates for cultural holidays to help expose folks to different cultural practices and foods and things like that? Um, One of the participants mentioned having a conversation with a mother who was a mother for someone with really severe autism, and recognizing that handicap parking is nice, but when her son would have an outburst, there was no, and her son was getting bigger. So she literally has to drag him away. So that was a key avoidance to being able to use public spaces because of that fear of, I don't know if I can even get him to the car where I need to park. So it's those types of insights I think are really important to think about. Well, I never thought about that because, if you haven't had someone with severe autism, you just wouldn't understand, how you use public space and things that go into that. Another thing that really came out that I don't think people really thought about was what's communicated when alcohol is in it. It was at use at public events. It automatically made certain cultural groups feel not welcome because they couldn't be in the space with alcohol. So all of those things, again, if you're not living it, you probably don't see it. And it's why the value of bringing those lived experiences in and bringing those lenses to the design process are so important.
So the next slide is top insights for project leaders.
Top insights. Okay. So I think one of the key things that I mentioned earlier too was, we rely on the relationship. Without the relationship, this process, that relationship and trust, some foundation to go off of, some foundation for community members to say, yeah, let's do this. Um, it's not going to work. You can't just bring you could bring a bunch of strangers together, but it's not going to have that cohesiveness. You're not going to be as productive in this process. And related to that, people matter, right? Like who those folks are, that they themselves have empathy for each other, that there's some of that humility to recognize we don't know what we don't know. And this is precisely the process, this iterative process to sort of collectively learn together. You don't get there without the right mix of people. We found that the co-designers are really your best marketing tool because they're going to be able to communicate and point to the things that they had these conversations in their community and now can point to certain things to say, we did that, right? Like that is far more effective marketing than any sexy brochure or video you're ever going to make. The process is a balance. It isn't just, okay, here's what community wants, let's swing that way, or here's what the designers say is feasible, let's swing that way. It's the tension between those perspectives and why you involve both of them at the same time, because there's probably something in between those perspectives that's going to be most valuable, most likely to provide value to the community. And then sort of this iterative approach, and you really do need that strong facilitation. If you don't have a facilitation that can take the community's lead and turn those into artifacts and next steps and things like that, it's also going to be people will probably feel far less productive and feel like they're spinning a bit more. What is gained is next, I think. So hopefully other people are seeing these slides.
Jess, there's
So
a couple questions for you in the chat
oh,
real quick.
sure.
So first one is, were there any issues with paying the co-designers for their time? Did DMC or the city make payments? I can answer that one. So
Yeah.
we set up job descriptions for the co-designers, so it was a pretty clear expectation for their role in the project and what was expected of them, as well as how it related to the project sequence. In this case, we paid them through a grant this first time. In the current project that co-designers are being used on the rapid transit project, it was, I believe, built into the community engagement budget or portion of the project. So it's kind of really just zero focused on building upon current community engagement practices and really getting in the next level of expertise and insight into what makes this project more relevant to the community at large.
Mm-hmm.
The next question here is, can you share the importance of the facilitator role for groups like this? Any special skills or tools that a facilitator can rely on? What resources are available to develop those?
That's a great question. I'm not sure about sort of resources. I think so. I come from a background of human-centered design. I think that in some ways gives some tools, but not most of human-centered design isn't that way. I think the problem with most facilitation is that it's called facilitation management. And true facilitation, it's something that Kevin and I have been talking about, sort of next steps for this is how do we build out some materials, some training, some support so that we can sort of build competency in this area, because I don't feel like there's a great one place to go or one skill set. I think most important though would be a semi-personable human that's leading it. People can relate to and can sort of live with that. It's sort of similar to the personality traits I think we were looking for in our co-designers, which is comfort with some ambiguity. I think an eye for being able to synthesize, but not again dictate. and has the time to be able to not just facilitate these sessions, but probably the more important aspect of this work, as I mentioned, was when you're following up with these co-designers one-on-one, and you can sort of help coach and guide the work directly as it's most applicable to that co-designer, is going to be the key piece of that. But unfortunately, I don't think there is any one place or set of tools, and that's something that I think, given this question and given what we've seen, Kevin and I are sort of looking at building something out.
Yeah, there are a couple of resources being mentioned in the chat too. Art of Hosting through the
Yeah,
University
yeah.
of Minnesota Extension, Civic Engagement. Yeah, there are definitely ones out there. Another question, Jess, did you use any graphic facilitation?
Let's see. We did, to the degree that we sort of created templates for folks to sort of use or adapt. And like I said, some folks did PowerPoint presentations, some folks did collages, things like that. So it was sort of, what we really try to do is give folks something tangible that they could start from, so that everyone had at least a similar start point, and then they could sort of adapt off of that based on cultural, individual preferences, and just sort of ability of the time they were able to dedicate to it, etc. So what we tried more than anything was just to give them all something to go and leave from, versus which I think is part of the most good facilitation, is that it's left too abstract and people aren't fully sure of what they're supposed to be, what they might do next.
Great, thanks, Jess. The next question here is, what do you hope listeners walk away with from this presentation? Why is this important? I think that's kind of captured in the slide you're about to speak to.
Yeah, sure.
And another one is, were the local community engagement meetings publicly noticed? If so, how are they advertised? The answer to that is yes. There's kind of a separate, broader open house set of meetings set up for the Discovery Walk that were publicly noticed for the project. And I imagine a portion of those will continue too as we work our way through design. But there's kind of two simultaneous engagement processes, one for these community co-designers that were meant to inform kind of these themes for the park, and then open house meetings as well that were publicly noticed that were meant to keep the public informed about the project itself.
Right. And we invited other folks that, like age-friendly folks, an individual that's working in age-friendly communities, for example. So we included a few other key stakeholders in those design sessions to sort of add their perspective, given communities they're working with, et cetera. But again, part of it is keeping it broad enough that people can engage, but narrow enough that it's meaningful engagement for those that are participating. And we're not, again, the key point to this is that you're able to get deeper than most other approaches, which is, I think, points to what it was gained, is that deeper level of engagement that you're not going to get even if you had 100 open houses, because generally you stay at the same depth of conversation. This, again, you're able to go deeper, you're able to build on that trust. You were able to take that first conversation and build a follow-up conversation, and then build a sort of recommendation conversation. The other thing is that it's, given that it was 7 people, 16 to 18 hours, it's relatively small investment in terms of what you actually get in return. So it may actually be in some ways a more efficient and effective form of community engagement. Not that it's fully to take place of some of the other engagement practices, but this is really, I think, gives context, meaningful context to the design team, which is what we heard from the design team. They were just really surprised by the level of sophistication and depth of preparation that folks came with, versus the community meetings and convenings, where you don't have that longitudinal engagement or the accountability sort of baked in. And then obviously it's about bringing that diversity and inclusivity into the process, not just for the community members, the co-designers. They now have a different expectation of what community engagement should look like, but also on the decision maker side. That number one, it's not as scary or unruly as I thought it would be. And number two, this actually does provide unique value that I probably don't get in any other formats. I'm going to get those insights. So it is, again, a value add rather than, oh, we're going to make an argument that it's the right thing to do. There really was a value add here that the design team, that the decision makers saw in such a way that they hired the design team on throughout the design development phase as well.
Great, Jess. There's a couple questions in there
Mm-hmm.
in the chat here. Do we have any substantial disagreements about features and how were they resolved, if so?
I think there's maybe some ongoing. I think one of the things that we learned in this process too, and had a hunch, was that even earlier involvement with the community group, the set of these co-designers, would be great, because I think we tend to spend a lot of time on issues or ideas that maybe don't matter that much to community. So I think more than anything, the earlier you can involve community in that co-design process and even the conception of these projects, the better. And I think DMC is looking at how do we do that and how do we just bake in this kind of approach as a standard practice.
Another question is, could a World Cafe facilitation style work for this community-based research design process? Would having several groups of 6 to 8 people instead of one be more beneficial to expand the input of ideas?
It can be. I mean, there's always sort of pros and cons, right? Like, you may have more perspectives, but you may fall into more groupthink, right? Like that. I think more than anything, and it's why I tend not to focus on one particular practice over another, is that iterative structure. If you apply it to that iterative structure where people can come together and then you can do a World Cafe or something, but then go out and have these one-on-one conversations or explorations in their community, because sometimes it may be, depending on the project, they might do more graphic analysis or asset mapping or journey mapping or tools like that. But as long as they have that opportunity to go out into those networks and access that information and bring it back, you break that groupthink. You gain insights that aren't part of that convening already. And I think that if you can just follow more of that iterative process, and then it also sort of will raise questions, because I also always get questions of, how do you know it's the right set of folks? How do you know it's you're looking to address? And my response is, you don't, and it's precisely why you need an iterative approach that will help illustrate whether or not you're on the right track far earlier with far less resources.
Great. One more, Jess, do you think this type of engagement can be done virtually?
Yeah, I do, and again, because of the structure. So I have been doing similar projects virtually. So when you bring folks together, I think there's something, you miss something with the relationship building piece that, again, you just can't synthetically create through a virtual setting. But because they are in the community and can have trusted conversations, that structure of coming together in a virtual format and then going out and having these conversations, be them socially distanced or over the phone or over Zoom or even in the same household, the structure itself pairs well with, as well as can be, with a virtual setting.
Great. So I advanced to the where else might this be applicable? And we have about 4 minutes left.
Sure. Review. Okay, here. So you Kevin mentioned a couple different projects we're sort of looking into in terms of, where it might be, where this process might be implemented. And again, part of this is that it's going to look different in each of these, based on where the project's at, the resources, who's involved, et cetera, the community being impacted. But the small area development plan that's in discussion, the rapid transit, they've already identified co-designers to participate in that process. We're having conversation with age-friendly communities and looking at 2021, some co-design process for that. And then there's, grants and task force, the intercultural cities initiative. There's a lot of different opportunities and projects, and we're also looking at, per that question that came up, that facilitator training, that competency building, that we'll be able to sort of, our intention isn't to own any of this stuff because it isn't ownable, right? It's sort of drawing from a lot of what's already out there, but rather find the right fit for this work and help build the competency to do this much more broadly, so that again, it's just a default rather than some of the other less effective community engagement strategies that might be out there.
Yeah, if there are any questions for Jess, we have a couple minutes left and happy to field those. So yes, we'll share the slides and the link to this recording after today. So that'll come out probably in the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. And then Jess, another question is, what safety stuff is going to happen? Curbs exist for a reason. Can we talk a little bit maybe about the accessibility elements that were brought up?
Yeah, sure. I think more than anything, it was not so much, you go curbless. It's where there are curb cuts, right? Like thinking about the climate we live in. Navigating in the winter, you can have all the curb cuts in the world, but how often are they actually cleared? So it was more of a sort of policy question than it was, the physical design, because I think how these spaces are maintained, given our unique and sometimes harsh climate, recognizes that, oh yeah, as someone with limited mobility, my city may only be accessible certain months of the year, which also doesn't feel very welcoming and gets back to that key question.
Yeah, and one other element I guess I'd add to answer that is there's a lot of ways to kind of separate cars and pedestrians too. So
Yeah.
curbs are one way, but there are others, and landscaping elements, methods of play, or like play stanchions or benches are all kind of being looked at as part of this design to help achieve that safety, but maybe in a different manner. All right. If a participant didn't show up for a session, was the expectation they had to read notes to catch up? Just trying to get a sense, because sometimes there are gaps in attendance. The whole group is set back a bit.
Yeah, it was very punitive. No, I kid. I don't know that anyone actually missed, but we built that out in the job description. We realized things were going to come up, and people might not be able to make it. It was more so than on me as the facilitator. I would spend, instead of that 15-minute check-in, I'd spend 30, 45 minutes with that individual to incorporate that into what the group was already discussing and catch them up.
Great. Thanks, Jess, for a wonderful presentation, and to the audience for all these questions. This is awesome. Really appreciate your time. That is kind of concludes our October sustainability series. Next month, we'll have our November one. It's on the third Wednesday. So be prepared for an email about that. But otherwise, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Have a good day.